when a Supreme Court justice smirked and dismissed her as out of her league. No one expected what Jasmine Crockett said next. It was supposed to be routine, another back and forth buried in the endless chatter of hearings. But in a single instant, the atmosphere shifted from the dull hum of politics to the edge of your seat silence of history being written. Clarence Thomas leaned back, his voice carrying the calm arrogance of someone who had sat on the nation's highest bench for decades. His words were not merely a critique. They were a dismissal, dripping with the unspoken message, you don't belong here. Laughter flickered in the chamber, sharp and cold, the kind that cuts deeper than any insult. It wasn't humor. It was dismissal. It was hierarchy. It was power mocking dignity. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not blink. For a heartbeat, she let the weight of his words linger in the air, heavy as stone. Around her, the crowd shifted uneasily, some waiting for her to shrink, others certain she would be silenced. After all, Thomas had mocked countless critics before. He had outlasted scandal, brushed off dissent, survived on the smirk of untouchable power. Why should this be any different? But Crockett's eyes locked forward with the steady fire of someone who had lived her entire life being underestimated and had turned that underestimation into fuel. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, the kind of pause that tells the room, I am not rattled, I am preparing. The silence stretched. Thomas's smirk widened, convinced he had landed the blow. For him, this was victory, a reminder of who was seated on high and who was meant to be small. Yet in that silence, something was building. The audience could feel it in their chests, a pressure rising, as if the chamber itself understood that this was not going to be another moment of casual dismissal. Because Crockett was not about to fade into the background. She was about to rewrite the moment. And when she finally opened her mouth, her words would do more than answer an insult. They would ignite a storm. But to understand why this moment hit like a lightning bolt, we need to see who these two really are. This wasn't just about one exchange. It was about who gets to define justice in America. The clash between Clarence Thomas and Jasmine Crockett wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was unfolding in a country where trust in its highest court was crumbling, where questions of integrity and identity were no longer whispers in legal circles, but rallying cries on the streets. For years, the Supreme Court had been painted as untouchable, the final word, the sacred arbiter of law. But scandal after scandal had chipped away at that veneer. Headlines of undisclosed luxury trips, shadowy benefactors, and conflicts of interest had turned the court into a symbol of privilege rather than purity. And no justice stood more at the center of that storm than Clarence Thomas. He represented a kind of power Americans were growing weary of, cloaked in authority, yet increasingly divorced from accountability. For his critics, his laughter at Crockett was not just personal mockery, it was emblematic of a deeper rot, the sneer of an institution that believed itself beyond challenge. His smirk carried decades of unchecked power, a reminder that, for too long, certain figures had wielded the gavel without fear of consequence. But Jasmine Crockett was cut from another cloth entirely. Young, unapologetic, rooted in community struggles, she was not shaped by the marble halls of privilege, but by the lived realities of those who had to fight for recognition. To her supporters, she was the embodiment of what representation truly meant, not just a seat at the table, but a voice that could not be muted. And that's why this moment mattered. This wasn't simply about a courtroom bar. It was about whether a woman like Crockett could stand tall against the dismissive machinery of establishment power and not only endure, but prevail. Her silence before the storm was a symbol to millions who had been told they were too inexperienced, too loud, too different, too of their league. In the background, the political climate was on fire. Movements for racial justice had reshaped the national conversation. Immigrant families were demanding dignity. Voters, especially young ones, were questioning whether the system had ever truly been built for them. The tension in that chamber reflected the tension across the country. Who gets to decide what justice looks like? Who is allowed to be the interpreter of the law, and who is forced to sit quietly, grateful just to be present? When Thomas mocked, he thought he was putting a younger colleague in her place. But what he underestimated was that Crockett's very presence represented something larger than herself. She carried with her the frustrations of a generation tired of hypocrisy, the voices of communities tired of being silenced, and the determination of a country that still believed dignity could rise from the ashes of arrogance. That was why the silence before her response was so heavy. It wasn't just anticipation of a witty comeback. It was the collective hope of millions funneled into one voice, waiting to see if she could deliver. And she would. Because this was bigger than Thomas, bigger than Crockett, bigger than a single hearing. This was about America's reckoning with its own definition of justice, whether it would remain a playground for the privileged, or finally a stage where truth could stand on equal footing. And the arrogance on display from the bench, it didn't come from nowhere. For decades, Thomas has wielded power with a smirk, untouchable, unaccountable until now. His name alone has become shorthand for a certain kind of American power, cloaked in respectability on paper, but cloaked in controversy once you scratch the surface. Clarence Thomas, the man who ascended to the Supreme Court amid scandal, has remained one of its most enduring and divisive figures. And the truth is, his career has been a study in arrogance disguised as authority. To understand why his mocking of Jasmine Crockett struck such a raw nerve, you need to trace the long shadow he has cast. For years, critics have pointed to the web of luxury trips, undisclosed gifts, and billionaire benefactors that seem to orbit his position. Vacations on private yachts, stays at sprawling estates, flights on private jets. None of it reported as the law demands. These weren't innocent oversights. They were patterns. Patterns that told a story of a man who believed rules were for others, not for him. Even as journalists uncovered these connections, Thomas often responded with the same dismissive shrug, the same faintly amused expression that told the public, "I'm beyond your reach." That smirk became his armor, a shield against accountability. And in many ways, it worked. No matter how loud the outrage, no matter how damning the headlines, he remained where he was, untouchable on the nation's highest bench. But the scandals were never just about money. They were about the erosion of trust. Here was a justice meant to embody impartiality, yet his rulings aligned with the interests of those whose wealth had kept him comfortable. Critics argued that his very presence on the court had become a symbol of captured power, a justice not for the people, but for the privileged few who could buy proximity. And yet it wasn't just corruption that defined him, it was the contempt. Throughout his career, Thomas has shown a remarkable ability to dismiss dissent with condescension. Whether it was colleagues, activists, or critics, his approach was rarely to engage but to belittle. When confronted, he often leaned back, arms folded, a smile tight, a performance of control meant to remind everyone of their place beneath him. That's why his jab at Jasmine Crockett carried more weight than just words. It wasn't a stray insult, it was part of a pattern. He has made a career out of cutting down those who dared to challenge him. Women, especially, have borne the brunt of his dismissals, stretching all the way back to the Anita Hill hearings when his sneering denials left scars that have yet to heal. For millions of women, his smirk that day in the chamber wasn't new. It was a reminder of the silencing they had seen before. Over time, Thomas became not just a man, but a symbol, a living reminder of what it looks like when institutions protect the powerful instead of the people. His arrogance wasn't incidental. It was cultivated. It became his language, his signal to the world that he could bend the rules, take the gifts, silence the voices, and still sit on high, robed in the authority of the law. But symbols cut both ways. What once looked like unshakable authority has, in recent years, begun to look like rot. The same smirk that once cowed critics now sparks outrage. The same detachment that once shielded him now makes him look isolated, out of touch with the America he presumes to judge. The scandals that were once footnotes are now front page news. The arrogance that was once feared is now mocked. And that was the stage on which Jasmine Crockett entered. To him, she may have seemed like just another voice, another critic to dismiss with a glance, another moment to smirk his way through. But in reality, she represented something he hadn't faced in years: authenticity, rootedness, and a voice that carried the strength of lived struggle. For decades, Clarence Thomas had sat above it all, his throne unshaken, his arrogance unchecked. But facing him this time wasn't just another critic. It was someone forged by struggle. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from privilege. She came from the fight. Every line in her story is written in resilience, in grit, in the kind of struggle that sharpens the tongue and steels the spine. Unlike the man smirking down at her from the bench, Crockett was not born into networks of influence, nor did she climb the ladder by stepping on others. She clawed her way forward through determination, persistence, and a belief that the law could be more than a tool of the powerful, that it could be a shield for the voiceless. Her roots run deep in communities that too often live in the margins of America's promises. Growing up, she saw the disparities not as abstract talking points, but as lived realities. She watched families wrestle with systems designed to fail them. She saw how easily dignity could be stripped away when opportunity was withheld, and she felt even then that her life had to mean more than survival. It had to mean change. Law school wasn't an inevitability for Crockett. It was an uphill climb. And when she arrived, she did not find herself embraced by a culture ready to see her thrive. She encountered skepticism, dismissiveness, the sideways glances that said, prove you belong here. Instead of shrinking, she thrived under the pressure. Each exam, each challenge, each courtroom appearance was another chance to turn doubt into fuel. By the time she stood in court as a civil rights lawyer, Crockett had long since learned that the system was never going to hand her respect. She would demand it. Her early career was marked by cases that rarely made headlines, but changed lives. She defended the marginalized, the forgotten, the ordinary people crushed by extraordinary injustices. Whether it was a family facing eviction, a protester silenced by overreach, or a worker stripped of rights, Crockett stood beside them, using the law not as an ornament of prestige, but as a sword and shield. These were not glamorous cases. They didn't bring wealth or fame. They brought something deeper: trust. Communities came to see her not just as an attorney, but as a fighter who understood their battles, because in many ways they were hers too. Politics came later, and it came the same way. Through the fight, when she ran for office, she wasn't backed by billionaire donors or cushioned by a powerful family name. She was propelled by grassroots energy, by volunteers who saw in her a voice unafraid to speak truth to the halls of power. In the Texas House and later in Congress, she made a name for herself not by being polite in the face of arrogance, but by calling it out. She embraced her sharpness, her fire, her unwillingness to let anyone, Republican or Democrat, define her limits. For many watching across the country, Crockett became more than a politician. She became a symbol of what it meant to carry yourself with both fire and dignity. She was unfiltered, unapologetic, and unafraid of being underestimated. And that, in many ways, was her secret weapon. Where others sought to blend in, she thrived by standing out. Where others softened their words to appease the powerful, she sharpened hers to cut through the noise. So when Clarence Thomas tried to laugh off her legal chops, he wasn't mocking a novice. He was mocking a woman who had spent her entire life being told she didn't belong, only to prove again and again that she did. Every battle she had fought up to this point had prepared her for moments like this, moments where arrogance meets authenticity, where condescension collides with conviction. That is why the silence before her response felt electric. She wasn't pausing because she lacked words. She was pausing because she knew exactly how to use them. For Crockett, words weren't weapons of theater. They were weapons of truth. And she understood the weight of her story, the weight of her fight, the weight of everyone she carried with her. Immigrants, women, people of color, the marginalized, the mocked, was about to pour into her next sentence. This wasn't just another exchange in a long list of political spats. This was the culmination of a journey. A woman who had come from the fight was standing toe to toe with a man who had lived in the comfort of untouchable power. And in that collision, the stakes were not just personal, they were national. And when Thomas tried to belittle her in front of the nation, he picked the wrong opponent. The laughter in the room wasn't friendly. It was the laughter of dismissal. That cruel kind of chuckle that carries more weight than words, reminding everyone who is supposed to be small and who is meant to tower above. Clarence Thomas knew that sound well. He had cultivated it for years. It was the soundtrack of his power, the chamber bending, the audience signaling that the joke was on whoever dared to stand against him. He leaned back in his chair, lips curled, eyes heavy with condescension. His voice, of smooth yet biting, dripped with the kind of smugness only decades of unchallenged authority can ferment. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, dragging out her title as if to mock its legitimacy, "perhaps if you had spent more time studying the law and less time grandstanding, you might actually understand the complexities of this matter." The words floated above the chamber, polished but poisonous. A ripple of murmurs followed, punctuated by a few more hushed laughs. The message was unmistakable. Crockett was outmatched, outclassed, out of her depth. Thomas smirked as if the exchange was already over, his dismissal complete, his dominance reasserted. This was the theater he loved, the stage where he got to play the untouchable arbiter, while critics were reduced to props in his performance of superiority. But Jasmine Crockett was not a prop. She sat upright, shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on him. On the outside, she appeared calm, serene, almost, but her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. Those who knew her best understood the signs, the subtle narrowing of her eyes, the way her hands stilled on the table, the quiet inhale through her nose. These were not the gestures of someone intimidated. They were the tells of a fighter sharpening her blade. Around her, the chamber buzzed. Some leaned in, sensing a clash was brewing. Others whispered nervously, unsure whether she would wither or strike. The energy was electric, unstable, as though the room itself was caught between the gravity of Thomas's status and the possibility, just the possibility, that Crockett would refuse to bend. Thomas chuckled again, louder this time, playing to the gallery. "I suppose it's not your fault," he added, feigning sympathy, "that certain individuals are simply out of their league when it comes to serious legal discussion. Some matters are, quite frankly, above your pay grade." The words hung in the air, sharp as knives. They weren't just meant for Crockett. They were meant for every woman, every young lawyer, every person of color who had ever been told they were unworthy of standing in the arena. And Crockett knew it. She could feel the weight of the insult pressing down, not just on her shoulders, but on countless others who saw themselves in hers. Still, she didn't rush. She let the silence stretch again, forcing the arrogance of his laughter to echo just a little too long, exposing it for what it was, weakness masquerading as confidence. Her eyes didn't waver. Inside, the calculation was precise. She had seen men like Thomas her whole life, men who confused power with wisdom, who believed longevity equaled legitimacy, men who expected silence in return for insult. And she had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this. The chamber grew restless. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into a low hum. The tension was unbearable, every second of her pause making the air heavier, every breath a reminder that the next words could tilt the balance of the room. And then, subtle but unmistakable, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. But then, Crockett leaned forward, and everything shifted. With one calm sentence, Crockett turned the smirk into silence. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade through fog. It wasn't raised, it wasn't frantic. It was steady, measured, deliberate. The kind of voice that makes people lean in, not because it shouts, but because it commands. "Justice Thomas," she began, her eyes locked squarely on his. "I may not have spent decades insulated by privilege, but I have spent my life practicing the law where it matters, on the ground, with real people whose lives are affected by decisions made in rooms just like this." The chamber fell into stillness. Even those who had laughed moments earlier stopped. It was the kind of stillness that comes when everyone knows something irreversible is about to happen. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, his smirk faltering for just a moment, but Crockett pressed on, her cadence deliberate. "You see, when you mock me for being out of my league, what you are really mocking are the communities I represent. The families who can't afford luxury retreats, who can't buy influence, who can't hide behind connections. My league is the people of America. And that, Justice Thomas, is a league you seem to have forgotten." A ripple of murmurs coursed through the room, followed by a sharp gasp from the gallery. The blow had landed, not just rhetorically, but morally. She had redefined the playing field. Suddenly, Thomas's authority wasn't the only authority in the room. He tried to chuckle, to wave it off, But Crockett wasn't finished. Her tone sharpened. Since you brought up the subject of understanding the law, let's talk about precedent, shall we? She reached for her notes, her hands steady, her eyes never leaving him. Because I know the law not from the ivory towers of unchecked power, but from representing clients in cases where precedent determined whether they kept their homes, whether they saw justice, whether they lived free. She began to list them, case after case, precedents that cut to the heart of civil rights, worker protections, voting rights. Cases Thomas had ruled on, often in ways that chipped away at the very principles he once claimed to uphold. With each citation, her voice grew stronger, her words landing with precision. You sided against the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder, weakening protections for millions of voters. You ignored decades of precedent in Dobbs, stripping away rights generations fought to secure. And you've sat silent, benefiting from billionaire-funded vacations while lecturing others about integrity. The audience audibly reacted now. A low rumble of disbelief, heads shaking, a few sharp gasps punctuating the rhythm of her dismantling. The once smug chamber was turning into a theater, and every viewer, inside and beyond, could sense the villain losing his grip. Thomas tried to interject, leaning into his microphone, Congresswoman. But she didn't allow it. She raised her hand slightly, not in disrespect, but in control. The gesture alone drew a hush over the chamber. And then she delivered the line that would echo beyond those walls. Justice Thomas, integrity is not about the length of your robe. It's about the weight of your conscience. And by that measure, sir, you are the one out of your league. Gasps, audible, visible, like a crack of thunder rolling across the room. Some covered their mouths. Others exchanged glances of disbelief. Even those who had laughed before sat stone faced now the arrogance drained from the air. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply let the words hang, their truth undeniable, their weight crushing. Her calm demeanor only amplified the devastation of her point. She wasn't shouting down a man in power, she was unmasking him. Thomas shifted again, his smirk gone entirely, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tight. The robe that once seemed untouchable now looked like armor too heavy to bear. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Crockett continued, but not with anger, with moral clarity. When I entered this chamber, I knew what I represented, not myself, not ambition, not ego, but the people who cannot speak here, the people who cannot defend themselves when powerful men laugh them out of the room. And I will not allow them to be mocked, dismissed, or erased, not by you, not by anyone. Every word rang like a gavel. She was no longer responding. She was leading. The chamber, once his stage, was now hers. One by one, heads began to nod. Staffers leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Even a few onlookers known for their skepticism could not help but acknowledge the undeniable poise before them. Crockett wasn't just answering an insult. She was shifting the narrative. And then, the final strike. You told me I was out of my league. But Justice Thomas, the league I stand in is made of every person who believes in equal justice, who still has faith in democracy, who refuses to bow to arrogance. That is the League of America. And the truth is, you left that league a long time ago. The chamber erupted, not in applause, because decorum demanded restraint, but in energy, the unspoken electricity that floods a room when everyone knows they've witnessed a turning point. Murmurs grew louder, eyes darted, phones lit up as staffers texted furiously. Clips would go viral before the hour was out. Thomas remained silent, his face a mask of frustration, his authority punctured by the weight of her words. He had mocked her, expecting dismissal. Instead, he had been dismantled by the very person he tried to belittle. And Crockett, she leaned back, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly before her. Not triumphant, not smug, simply resolute. Because for her, this wasn't about winning a moment. It was about telling the truth and ensuring it landed where it mattered most in the hearts of those watching. The smirk was gone. The silence was deafening. And the chamber, once Thomas's arena, had become her stage. But the real explosion came outside those walls. Within hours, millions had watched the clip, and the nation picked its side. What began as a tense chamber exchange had transformed into a digital firestorm. By the time the hearing adjourned, Crockett's words, "Integrity is not about the length of your robe, It's about the weight of your conscience. We're being clipped, shared, and replayed across every platform imaginable. Twitter lit up first. The hashtag #FanAutoFire League surged to the top of the trending board, joined quickly by Crockett McDrop and 5 League Off America. Users from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in, but the dominant narrative was clear. Crockett had stood her ground, and Thomas's smirk had finally met its match. Memes exploded. One viral image showed Thomas's smirk fading into a stunned silence. Caption simply, "That moment, you realize she's not backing down." TikTok creators remixed the clip with dramatic soundtracks, violins swelling, drums pounding, turning her takedown into a cinematic montage that drew millions of views in a matter of hours. On Instagram, reels spread with captions like, "This is how you speak truth to power." A late-night comedy wasted no time. Monologues framed Thomas as a relic of unchecked power, a man so arrogant he thought belittling a civil rights lawyer on national television would go unanswered. The punchline always circled back to Crockett's calm, poised counterstrike. Lauder now belonged to her side, and Thomas had unwittingly turned himself into the setup for every joke. Cable news devoted entire segments to replaying the exchange, analysts dissecting every pause, every flicker in Thomas's expression. One commentator declared, "What we saw was more than a sharp rebuttal. It was a generational shift." Crockett embodied the future of American politics, unapologetic, unflinching, and unwilling to be silenced. But it wasn't just pundits and politicians. Ordinary people, students, teachers, nurses, veterans took to social media to declare how much the moment meant to them. A young law student wrote, "As a black woman studying law, I've been told I don't belong 100 times. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett told me I do." A veteran tweeted, "Integrity isn't about privilege, it's about service." Crockett nailed it. And immigrant families across the country reposted her words with translations, framing them as proof that America's promise could still be defended. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself the target of unrelenting satire. Editorial cartoons portrayed him drowning in luxury gifts, while Crockett stood tall with nothing but a microphone and her conviction. Hashtags pairing his name with billionaires resurfaced, linking his scandals to the arrogance on display in the chamber. What he had intended as a moment of dominance had become a national symbol of disconnect. A man mocked for being too powerful to understand the people he judged. The ripple effects reached Capitol Hill. Lawmakers who had once tread lightly around Thomas's reputation suddenly spoke with renewed confidence, citing Crockett's dismantling as proof that the veneer of invincibility could be pierced. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder about ethics reforms, with her takedown replayed as fuel. And then came the international reaction. Clips translated into Spanish, French, and Hindi circulated on global news outlets, framing the exchange as a classic David and Goliath moment, a young congresswoman standing toe to toe with one of the most entrenched figures in American power. The symbolism was universal. Every nation has its untouchables, and every nation longs for someone brave enough to confront them. Crockett herself didn't gloat. She posted a simple statement. "I said what needed to be said. This fight is bigger than me." The humility only magnified the respect, turning her into not just a trending name, but a symbol of resilience. The aftermath was not contained to screens. On campuses, student groups held watch parties, replaying the moment as inspiration. At community meetings, activists quoted her words like scripture. And in living rooms across America, families who had long grown cynical about politics found themselves replaying the clip. Not because it was entertainment, but because it reminded them of something they thought they had lost: the possibility that dignity could stand against power and win. Clarence Thomas, once untouchable, was now a meme. Jasmine Crockett, once underestimated, had become a movement. The balance of perception had flipped in a single exchange, and the aftershocks were still spreading. But what this moment truly revealed wasn't just about Crockett or Thomas, it was about America. Because in the end, justice isn't a smirk. It's a voice that refuses to be silenced. What Jasmine Crockett showed in that chamber wasn't just a sharp rebuttal or a viral soundbite. It was the embodiment of something older, deeper, and stronger than arrogance, the principle that dignity, when wielded with courage, is the most unshakable form of power. She took Thomas's insult, his attempt to reduce her to out of her league, and reframed it as a lesson for the nation. Leagues, after all, are not defined by the wealthy, the connected, or the smug. They are defined by the people who keep fighting when the odds are stacked against them. Her words reminded America that arrogance can mock, belittle, and laugh. But arrogance cannot outlast truth. And corruption, no matter how deeply rooted, cannot forever silence integrity. In the pause between his smirk and her response, the whole country glimpsed the fragile confidence of unchecked power and the unbreakable resolve of someone who represents more than herself. For Crockett, this moment was never about ego. It was about service. Her calm, deliberate dismantling of Thomas's authority was not designed to elevate her name, but to affirm a truth that power must always be accountable and that those who abuse it will one day face the clarity of someone brave enough to speak without fear. That truth is not limited to one chamber or one confrontation. It belongs to anyone who has been told they don't belong, anyone who has been mocked for daring to enter a room where others believed they had no right to stand. Crockett's stand transformed from a personal defense into a collective declaration. You are not out of your league. You are exactly where you belong. And this is what resonated most. Viewers didn't just see a congresswoman taking down a justice. They saw themselves. They saw their struggles, their dismissals, their moments of doubt mirrored in the chamber, and they saw the possibility of overcoming. It was validation, not only that arrogance can be challenged, but that dignity, even in the face of mockery, can rewrite the story. The lesson is simple yet profound. True justice does not wear the mask of superiority. True justice is steady, patient, rooted in service. It is not performed for applause. It is spoken because silence would betray the people it represents. And in that moment, Crockett's voice carried far beyond the chamber. It carried into homes, communities, and hearts, sparking conversations about what kind of America people still want to believe in. Because America, at its best, has always been defined not by those who smirk from positions of power, but by those who dare to answer with integrity. Crockett's response was not the end of the fight, but a reminder that the fight is worth continuing. That arrogance will rise. Corruption will attempt to cloak itself in robes and titles, but dignity will remain, waiting for voices strong enough to call it forth. This is why her words matter. This is why the exchange will echo beyond the news cycle, beyond the memes, beyond the hashtags. It will live on as proof that courage can puncture arrogance, and that truth, even when delivered softly, has the power to shake the loudest silence. And that's why this debate moment will echo for years. In the end, the story that began with a smirk ended with silence. Clarence Thomas thought he could dismiss Jasmine Crockett with a laugh, reduce her presence to a punchline. Instead, he gave her the stage, and she used it to deliver a message that resonated far beyond the chamber walls. Her words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a reminder that truth, spoken with clarity and courage, can strip arrogance of its disguise. This is why her moment matters. It wasn't about ego or titles or even one hearing. It was about the larger fight for integrity and American power. It was about reminding us that no matter how untouchable someone seems, their arrogance crumbles when confronted with dignity. And Crockett's calm, unflinching stand proved that even the most powerful can be silenced when the truth is spoken without fear. That's the lesson we carry with us. Every time someone tries to tell you that you don't belong, every time a voice of arrogance tries to drown you out, remember this moment. Remember that justice is not measured in smirks or titles. Justice is measured in courage and truth, in the voices that refuse to be silenced. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you why these moments matter, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let others feel the same spark of validation, the same belief that dignity can stand against arrogance and win. Subscribe to this channel, join this growing community, and be part of amplifying stories that prove integrity still matters. Because when arrogance mocks, dignity answers, and dignity always wins.